Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's 2024. Great to see everybody back. This is going to be part two of the Chuck DeMore interview. We had a great interview with Chuck last time talking about kind of the old school Border Patrol over in the 80s. Chuck really gave us a lot of great information and some insight on what the border was like back then. Things still aren't changing. Here we are in 2024. We're doing another podcast for the Complete Solution Group, and things are not changing. So just today, the port of entry in Lukeville, Arizona, reopened, and there's no changes. There's absolutely no changes. So there's still a lot of people coming in illegally. The Border Patrol is overwhelmed. Katie Hobbs, the governor of Arizona, went down there a couple of weeks ago. She said how she's going to make a bunch of changes, and the National Guard is going to show up. There's zero National Guard in that area, in the Lukeville port of entry area right now. Zero. So smoke and mirrors, nothing's happening. Border Patrol is still being abused. So, right off the bat, Chuck, I just want to ask, these kind of games with politics, when we have officers that are out there, they're on the line, they're working their butts off, the morale is down in the Border Patrol right now, and you have these situations where politicians just show up and they just put on this puppet show. It's a bunch of smoke and mirrors. Nothing gets done. I mean, as a former Border Patrol guy, I mean, you used to have a lot of connections to guys in the patrol. I mean, how does that make guys, the men and women, feel when stuff like that happens?
Well, John, it's a matter of policy versus practice, frankly. We have policies in place that, by and large, at least to a much greater extent than we're seeing today, control the border. But our practices are totally incongruent with that. If you have policies and practices that have no congruence, you have, this cognitive dissonance where people are feeling like, well, we believe our border's under control, and the more information you begin to receive to the contrary, you're trying to comport that to your own belief system, and it just doesn't work. It creates frustration and tensions. And, the policies are in place to preserve the integrity of the border. The practices have completely gone by the wayside. Our country's in a very, very perilous place right now. And when you have laws on the books that you completely ignore, it tells your agents on the front line that what they're directed to do is not consistent with your desires. So it puts them in a very difficult position. It's that cognitive dissonance of trying to determine how to comport what we're seeing with what we believe. And sometimes those two things are very different. So I think the agents are very frustrated. It's very unfortunate to see the lack of control of the border with, I don't know how many agents we have today, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000. When I was in the Border Patrol in the early 80s, we had less than 3,000. So if the practices in 1983 allowed us to have a moderate control of the border, not control, but some semblance of it, and in 2023, with 19 or 20,000 agents, you're completely unable to control that border. It tells you that it's your policies that are failing you, not your practices. I mean, we have 20,000 agents on the ground down along the border, walking, back and forth, trying to deter, interdict, apprehend, process, remove. At the same time, when our administration is essentially communicating this message that we don't want that. We want our borders open. When you talk about cities like Cincinnati and, these other Miami at 400,000 or 500,000 people, and we're letting that many people in a month or every other month, it's appalling. And the impact will be felt across the spectrum in our country. Our jails are impacted, our streets are impacted, our hospitals are impacted, our schools are impacted. There's a principle in education that you only move as quickly as your slowest students. And when you have students that are recent arrivals from foreign countries that don't speak English, and now we're kind of forcing them into our public education system with the instructors being told to kind of keep it at a pace where everyone can keep up, it's slowing down the learning of the children that have been in the system for a number of years to accommodate people who have come here unlawfully and been put into that environment in a very short term. So the impact is broad, and it's going to get worse and worse until people realize that what we're being told is inconsistent with what we're practicing from an administrative policy.
You know, that education thing is real interesting. So when I first retired last year, I became a substitute teacher, got into the public school elementary system here, and was substituting there. And I saw exactly what you said. I mean, we had a lot of students who spoke multiple languages. And it's very hard to be a teacher and in that environment when you don't, I can speak some Spanish, but I couldn't speak Russian, I couldn't speak Pashto, I couldn't speak the other languages that these kids are speaking in the classroom. And then trying to communicate with all of those children and teach the other children that I had to in the classroom, it was impossible. So my heart goes out to these teachers who do this all the time, and and try to make these lessons plans and get through lesson plans, because they're not getting through the lesson plan. They're taking so much time and just trying to teach communication and keep kids on some kind of pace that they're really not helping educate and raise the educational value of the students that are in that classroom. I mean, that's why we're seeing a lot of reading levels drop. We're seeing math levels drop. We're seeing all these things impacted, and people don't really think about that. They're looking at the border and they're seeing what's coming into the country, and they're seeing this problem, this crisis we have, but they're not thinking about what's happening in the interior of the United States.
Right. And, I'm talking about this cognitive dissonance. We have what our education system tells us that they're doing, and then we have the practical reality of what they really are doing. And if you are, it is kind of an insidious, way of changing our society, but if you can get to our children and over a prolonged period of time begin to re-educate them at a young age, by the time they're adolescents, they're probably already in a completely contradictory place to the value systems of their parents. And by the time they're adults and raising their own children, you can forget any semblance of this country being what we've come to love and respect. And as we go into the future, we're going to see a deterioration of our own American culture because it's no longer being taught. And it's no longer held in high esteem. It's now looked at as somewhat of a bad thing. I mean, my wife recently found that she was related to people who had come over on the Mayflower, and so she's very interested in the genealogy, and she was doing that research. And it has always been something that Americans were proud of, to know that your ancestors came early. But now she's come to the realization that many people see that as a bad thing because they view those people as the conquerors, the imperialists who came and subjected the indigenous people to these unfortunate circumstances. But it's just the way we look at our country and the way we look at our own lives and the way we look at other Americans is changing so quickly that it's a little worrisome to me personally.
And Chuck, just to remind our listeners, I mean, you had a career in education before you joined the Border Patrol. So you were a professor, you taught, just so the listeners understand that when you're talking about education, it's coming from a place of a lot of experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I wanted to do. When I went to college, I wanted to be a teacher. And so I got my master's degree and taught for 4.5 years at a community college here in Arizona. I wouldn't say I was a professor, but a communicator, an educator. And that's how I ended up joining the Border Patrol. I met a couple of students who were Border Patrol agents, and it was just a natural pathway for me to get that kind of information about the patrol and to begin to learn about. I grew up in Arizona and never had an appreciation of the border, the vulnerabilities. In fact, when I was growing up, I don't think most of us saw that as a particular vulnerability. We knew that people were coming across illegally, but I don't think our country was in such a dire place as it is now with the world being the way it is. But now 40 years later, and I guess that's the only real thing I can provide you is a perspective on what the border looked like in 1983. And you know what it looks like in 2023 and now 2024. And again, I go back to the practices that we see are so inconsistent with the policies that we have. And who's to blame for that? Those people that enforce the policies. And, it's unfortunate that they're not being... the border is being left completely untended, as you can see.
Yeah, and John Martinez, I mean, you were in a patrol. I mean, you've seen the patrol in the middle 2000s, and up until you retired, last year as well. What are some of the things that you're seeing as a change, and related to some of the stories that Chuck's telling?
The one thing that's going to be real curious, and it'd be great to hear for Chuck, is that Border Patrol agents are like a Swiss Army knife. They have the ability to make vehicle stops, they have the ability to patrol the border, and there's a skill of sign cutting, tracking, and using the Spanish language and all these different skills they use. Now they're not using any of those skills. Now they're just literally, and Fab, you and I were in Lukeville down there watching them just standing around waiting for transport. You had agents at the office just processing in all these different and new languages. And once the pendulum swings back, the big question is now you're going to have to turn this Titanic around, this ship, and tell those Border Patrol agents go back to patrol. And not that you lose that skill set, but like anything, if you don't practice it enough, it's going to become detrimental to making sure that our borders are safe. And in the late 90s too, we only would arrest maybe 100 people per shift. And we're using, checkpoints, doing vehicle stops, but it was nothing like this. And, when you were talking about the policies, just before we got on, we were talking about how Bill Malusian had a tweet today where he said that was it the month of December, CBP reported that they had 302,000 encounters for the month of December, which is a broke a record. And then going back to October 1st, and if you combined everything from October 1st to present, that they said there was 750,000 people that came in. So in 3 months, equivalent for a city bigger than the size of Seattle made entry into our country. And then you hear people like the press secretary, and I know Fab's on Twitter, doing his best, saying, "Oh, this is just like seasonal, like this is natural, normal." And there's a term called seasonality in the border where you would see ebbs and flows, but nothing of this magnitude. And I know with the border, hearing from our friends in the Border Patrol, how now going back to Lukeville Port of Entry, they actually have now FPS, a Federal Protective Service, coming down here. So we're robbing from our assets in the interior to bring them to the border. And now the question is, what's going to happen to these places? I mean, these are federal buildings with civilians. Not all federal employees have a badge and gun, and now we're leaving them vulnerable. And you hear about the whole, I think it was just today, there's a high school active shooter situation going on. So right now, and then you hear the air marshals are pulled off of airplanes, and that's one of the things. So you have all these vulnerabilities that are coming up. And it's getting scary to see what happened. And like Fab was saying earlier, the port of entry reopened in Lukeville and nothing's changed. It was just literally a pause. And I think last week there was a cartel shooting down there that we found out from our friends. So there's, violence is still there. It's pretty serious, that stuff's going on. So from the late 90s to now, in my opinion, Chuck, it seems like the border's getting a little bit more dangerous. Not that it wasn't dangerous when you and I were in, and that's something that I want to touch on. What was your time in Brownfield, and that's something we're talking about before. Like when I was patrolling in the late 90s, early 2000s. We would just do the typical things of the Border Patrol agent, the checkpoint, sign cutting, responding to sensors. And at one time, I was on the bandit detail where we went after these bandits that were robbing migrants coming across at gunpoint. And they did it enough where the Luna County Sheriff said, "Hey, we need to do something." So the Border Patrol asked for volunteers. And one day I went down and we laid in on bandits to see, if we can apprehend them so they can get that to stop. But it was enough. And that's the thing that's just, I think from when I joined to now, it's just night and day, and it's sad to see what these men and women have to go through. Like I think one guy mentioned, he's like, now we're just professional Uber drivers. They don't even recognize their importance, and I think that's something. Hopefully, in November of this year, we get some good people in office, and there's a guy here on the middle of the screen that if we get the right people in office, that it can make that effective change. I think the people that went down to the border yesterday, again, we'll see what actions they have, but so far it's just all talk. They're saying, "Oh, the average American would cry." Then my question is, then why are you funding this administration? They're like, "Oh, we can't shut down the government." I was like, when my computer's not working, I unplug it and plug it back in, and guess what? It works again. Maybe that's what we need to do. But again, that's just this guy's thoughts. But Chuck, going back to your time, and I think it's quite fascinating, is just kind of just hear, like, what was your experiences, as a young guy, you're in your mid-20s, down in San Diego, less than 3,000 guys. So your station was minimally manned. It wasn't like they are today, these super stations. I mean, can you just, let us know kind of like what your experiences were? Then let's take that journey. I mean, because your career is fascinating, with what you saw, then going over to Hawaii. And I think a lot of people, like what happens in the islands, and then, coming back for 9/11. So, I mean, on that note, I'll just turn it over to you and kind of just hear about your experiences down in San Diego.
Well, it's one of the things about the Border Patrol. It's part of a mosaic. It's an enforcement mosaic. I was part of the INS back in the early 80s, you remember. And the INS was a relatively large organization that had a dual-fold mission, one being to provide benefits to those immigrants that were entitled, and one was to enforce the immigration laws with respect to keeping those that are not entitled out of the country. There was a great deal of pride and camaraderie, esprit de corps in the old patrol. I don't know if that exists today, and I would doubt it, at least to the extent that it existed before by virtue of what they're having to do now. Like, talk about glorified Uber drivers and diaper changers. I mean, I have told my family and my wife many times, I don't know that I could do it today. I could do it physically or, the mechanics of the job, but to do what these guys are being subject to doing, it's got to be degrading, demoralizing. I read an article right after Christmas that said that in Nigeria, 300 Christians were hacked to death on Christmas Day, simply to make a point. And I say that because in our country, our borders are so porous, and we're seeing hundreds of thousands. You alluded to, 750,000 people coming in, captured over 3 months. That's what we caught. What didn't we catch? And of the people that we catch, we don't know much about them, and we'll never know much about them, many of them. They come from countries where records are not kept, or where at least we wouldn't have access to those records. So we know we have people in foreign countries who are diametrically opposed to the way we live our lives. And by virtue of what took place in Nigeria on Christmas Day, we know that there are many people in foreign countries who would do us immeasurable harm provided that they had the opportunity. And what's mind-boggling is why we are giving them that opportunity. You talked about the Border Patrol. The mission that they have is a very, very difficult one. But when you're provided the resources and the respect to do the job, that's one thing. When you're under-resourced, disrespected, it just doesn't portend well for the border, for the security of the country, because the border is only the first layer of defense. And when they penetrate that, they're in the interior. And if you look around at what's going on now in some of the large cities in the country, it's kind of comical to me. It's cities like New York and Chicago didn't have real heartburn with what's going on until it began to impact them directly. So as long as those immigrants were crossing the border in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and weren't rising, to the level of mass numbers coming into their venues, they're not concerned. It's only when those people start showing up on their doorstep, like they've been showing up on our doorsteps for years, that the barometer's through the ceiling. So I think it's imperative that we establish control of the border, and then begin working into the interior to ensure that those same resources that we put on the border are complemented and complementing the ones on the interior. Right now, we had the INS. It was an agency with a very defined mission, and that was abolished, and broken up into three agencies: CIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, to provide the benefit side, and then CBP to control the border, and ICE to control the interior, so to speak. And those agencies don't work particularly well all the time with one another. So there's very little deconfliction. I mean, the idea of standing up a Homeland Security sounded good. I think it has a lot of value, but there's still tweaks that need to be done. And one of those is the deconfliction that's necessary between those three agencies. I don't think the leadership in the department is providing the kind of leadership that's ensuring that consistency of application. between those three agencies, which were all really immigration agencies. And they're all kind of going in different directions. And I don't think there's that level of deconfliction that needs to take place. Second of all, until you remove the magnet, why would you expect to remove the problem?
Right.
The magnet
there's no deterrent. Yeah.
Yeah, the magnet is still here. They're coming here, many of them for honorable reasons, to come and make money to send home. That in and of itself is a problem for this country. So again, it's one of those issues where people have to realize, well, we want to help these people. There's a better way to do it than to let them come illegally into our country, send remittances back to their countries. And then ultimately, if they have the opportunity of going home, they will eventually go home because they prefer to be in their own country than ours. So it's a matter of, one, controlling the border, applying those same enforcement principles to the interior, controlling the interior. And that's what all of us really want. Even recent immigrants will tell you they want to be protected. They want national security preserved, domestic public safety observed. All of us want to be free and feel safe when we're out on the streets. And I think it's becoming less and less. I mean, we had a shooting today in a school, and it's just becoming, the country's becoming less of what it was during the Great Generation and more what it will reflect when it becomes a product of many generations and many peoples pouring into a, area that has very little leadership, very little leadership from our administration in life.
Right. Hey, Chuck. So, like you had pretty much gone into retirement when the sanctuary city policies really started to pick up. I mean, I'm sure LA has always kind of been a little bit of a sanctuary city. New York has always been, but the real, I guess, written documentation that these were now sanctuary cities and codification in state legislature and local city policy really started picking up under Obama. And then, really, I mean, we started to see the real pandering to that, during the Trump administration, because people just wanted to block a lot of the laws that Trump was coming up with. What do you think about, how these sanctuary cities are reacting? They asked for this. They stood there, they pounded their chest. They wanted to be sanctuary cities. And now all of a sudden they're seeing hundreds of thousands of people wind up at their doorstep and they're crying about it. So, what do you think about that whole situation?
Well, I think it's a difference between your philosophical values and your practical values. I was the district director for INS in San Francisco. Started that in 2000, I believe. And even back then, San Francisco, whether it was a declared sanctuary city or undeclared, it was a sanctuary city. We had meetings many, many times with the city officials from San Francisco and other public elected officials in the area. And I would tell them each and every time that they would say, this is a sanctuary city. These people are free to come here. And I'd tell them, that's your prerogative to declare yourself a sanctuary city. It's my prerogative to enforce immigration laws in the city of San Francisco. There's a federal clause that gives the federal government supremacy over the states. And so, even though they would claim to be sanctuary cities, it really had no impact on the way that I managed my portfolio in San Francisco. I did it the way I believed it should be done and the way that the law dictated that it be done. And in those days, at least, the administration was not breathing down my back to do the contrary. They allowed the directors to basically manage the portfolios in their respective jurisdictions consistent with the policies that were in place at the time. And it worked a lot better than it's working today.
Yeah, Chuck, when I was out there, so I got out to San Francisco in 2006, and at that time, the San Francisco Police Department could not contact ICE at all for the folks that were in their custody. So we actually had a fax machine where we had officers man, where we would get anonymous tips coming in saying, hey, John Favretore just came in here, he's from, wherever foreign. And then we would go there. But when you walked into that jail on Bryant Street, you got zero support from them. And I remember doing operations in the city where, as you know, with fugitive operations, we would call in their dispatch to say, hey, we're going to be in the area. I walked up to a San Francisco police officer and I said, hey, just let you know, we'll be across the street going after a person there. And he looked at me and like literally like terrified. He goes, "Do you need anything from me right now?" And I was like, "No." He goes, "Well, I can't be seen by you because if I am, I'll get fired. I'm going to walk around at the end of the block and I'll just stay there. If I hear our dispatch call, I'll come and help you out." And he literally walked away from me. So to know that as an officer doing immigration work in these cities, these sanctuary policies, and I imagine that officer is a great guy. But again, when you have policies that dictate, hey, if you help immigration, you'll get fired or lose your job, it makes you wonder. And again, the people there said, oh, these poor people, like you just said, those poor people want to be protected. The same people in their country they fled are here, and they're probably still committing the same abuses. We're not helping these people out. You actually make them bigger victims than they were before because they already left their country. They came here for some kind of sanctuary. And now you're literally letting the wolves prey on the sheep. And that's the sad part. Is San Francisco, I think in its mind, it thinks it's helping, and it's not. I mean, the places we went to, and the crimes we were going after, it would make most people kind of shudder of what's going on. And we are literally those guard dogs out there trying to keep the peace out there. But San Francisco, and also too, when Kate Steinle got murdered, San Francisco officials went down to Victorville to literally break this guy out of jail, bring him to the city. They tried to figure out what to do with him for 2 weeks because they had some kind of 1995 drug charge on him. So it was over 10 years old, or was it 20 years old? And then they let him go. And they didn't tell us about it. They just let this guy walk out. He ends up breaking in some park ranger's car, shoots Kate Steinle. I think he said he was going to target practice so he can go up to the wharf to shoot the sea lions. And when that happened, going back to Obama, they didn't send anybody out to kind of remember that woman who did nothing. She was out there in the pier with her father, just having a daughter-father moment in July, and she was murdered for no reason. And San Francisco didn't even flinch. They're like, it happens.
Well, how many Americans have been victimized by people who are unlawfully present in the United States in the last few years? A lot. It's one thing when we have to let very serious, violent criminals out of prison onto the streets that are U.S. citizens and they've served their sentence and we have no recourse but to free them, knowing that the likelihood is very good that they're going to perpetrate some additional crimes on unsuspecting Americans. Well, that we can't do anything about. But we can do something about criminal individuals who are unlawfully present, who are getting out of incarceration, and they should all be removed. And then we should have a border that keeps them out. It's one thing to identify a problem. It's another thing to deal with it. We have identified in this country with respect to immigration many, 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 many problems. And our elected representatives can't seem to come to any consensus or agreements on how to solve this problem. So maybe we need to solve our own problem, get rid of those people and get some people in there like John who can fix this problem. Because it's not getting better. It's getting worse. I was in Europe when the war in the Middle East began between Hamas and Israel. And I can tell you it was a very, very different feeling being out of the United States and watching that unfold on television. It was a much more emotional event somehow. And we went from, one hotel to another. And every time we go into a hotel, you turn the TV on, that's all that was on, at least on the English-speaking channels. And then we felt this incredible anxiety about it, what's going on in the world. And when we got back home, it was totally different. It was like, well, I can watch that on this channel. Then I can flip over to football and watch some football. And then I'll go over and watch some, sitcoms. It doesn't seem to resonate the same in the United States as it does when you're out of the United States. At least for me, it didn't. And that's, I think, because I feel so safe here, by and large. I'm an American. I'm in the United States. I feel it's a big country. There's a lot of assets and resources to protect me. When you go out of the country, you don't have that protection. You don't feel that security. And it's beginning to feel a little less secure now for us in our own country. And that's a really scary thing because we know how hostile the world has become or has been for a long time and is becoming more hostile. And you certainly don't want to see that kind of stuff coming into the United States. And if you let in, what did you say, John, 750,000 people in the last 3 months, something like that? if only 3% of those people are going to cause us future problems, I don't know what the number is, but 3% of 750,000 is a fairly sizable number, and 3% of 9 million that may have come in over the last whatever number of months or years is a greater problem. So until we identify the problem, which I think we're pretty well along the way of doing, and then until we do something about it, which we're not at all along the way of doing, we're going to continue to see the same consequences that we're seeing now. And it's going to get worse because, again, these people, you would be very naive to think that our enemies are not watching our border situation and taking advantage of it. The cartels, we know, take advantage of it every single day, moving bodies and drugs and other contraband across that border. It doesn't take a lot of brain power to move that thought process along to seeing terrorists moving their implements of destruction into our country. And when we have literally no control of the border, we have no idea what's coming across. I just shudder to think what could happen down the road.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming back on with us again, Chuck. Is like I said, it's always good to really get that kind of background view on what was going on at the border back 20 years ago, and compared to what's going on today. I mean, like you've said, we always had people coming across the border. We were always working the border, always making those arrests. But as all of us, all three of us here on this show right now have worked for immigration. We've all invested our lives into trying to keep this country safe. And all three of us can say that what is going on right now at the border is not usual. This is a crisis. It is a chaos loop. It is going to continue to get worse. And, it's good to have guys like you, that been in retirement for a couple of years come out and say, hey, this is a bad situation. It's definitely not what this administration is trying to make it out to be. So, we appreciate you coming on the show. We hope to have you on again soon. And we just appreciate you. Thank you, Chuck.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Chuck. Man, we'll talk to you soon.
All right, Chuck.